afternoon. Thank you very much for your registration. We now are ready to start our press conference. We will take questions in groups like before. So please, we can start it now. Thank you.
Hi, I'm James Crisp from Euractiv. I have two quick questions. The first is about the reports focus on what's happened in Ukraine, and how would you characterize the impact of the Ukraine crisis on its energy mix, and its energy situation? And you mentioned in the presentation a couple of times the rule of law. Could you clarify exactly what is meant by that? Is that a war in Ukraine, or is it corruption in such and such a country? I mean, just a little bit more detail about that.
Hi, I'm Siobhan Hall from Platts. Just to follow up on that, sort of more generally, how optimistic are you that Ukraine can make reforms in its gas sector given the situation in Ukraine? And how important is it that Ukraine has passed this gas law that would bring it more in line with EU rules, and what the impact of that will be? And also a question on the Trans-Caspian gas pipeline. What are your hopes for that pipeline, and what difference do you think that will make to the EU?
I'm Judith Zagnál, working for Hungarian news agency Bruksinfo. I have questions related to Trans-Caspian pipeline as well. I read the Turkmen section of the report, and you seem to be very optimistic that there will be new momentum there. What exactly do you base your optimistic assumptions on? And I also saw, it's maybe a question more to the Commission, that the Caspian Development Corporation is being mentioned in the Turkmen section. This idea started out as almost like a buying cartel, and trying to put together gas demand by companies and presenting it in one window to the Turkmen government. Is it still the same concept behind the CDC, or it's something else now?
Well, first about Ukraine. We did two in-depth reviews on Ukraine, one in 2006 and one in 2012, and now it's part of this broader report. Ukraine, in our view, is a country with a huge potential. It's rich in a number of resources, and as you mentioned, the acceptance of the gas law will certainly have a positive effect on what they are doing in using their resources. The other thing is they have huge potential in energy efficiency, and that's really untapped. So working on that would be very important, not only for the Ukraine economy, but also for their energy situation. The other interesting thing is that Ukraine, of course, is not interesting, but is a thing that has to be borne in mind. Ukraine has lived through two important crises, economic crises in the past. So that means that a lot needs to be done there. At this moment, we are working with Ukraine on the issue of energy efficiency, because that is really something that has more than one benefit. It's not only using your energy in a more efficient way, but it also creates jobs. It brings benefits to health. It brings benefits to diversification, because you need less to import. So this is, and you need less electricity to be produced. So this is really quite important that we're working on that. The governance issue, well, it really has to do with a number of things. In some countries, there is still the question of, let me put it in a very friendly way, preferred suppliers. Others would call it corruption. But it's something that is there. The most important thing for investors is that there is a stable, open investment climate. And that's something that really needs to be worked on, because otherwise the necessary money won't come. For Ukraine, as a major transit country, it's of course some other transit countries are there as well. As a major transit country, it's also important that the work of the Energy Charter, which is really protecting investments in transit countries, is going to be highlighted as well. So that I would like to mention. Then you mentioned the mentioned TANAP. We think that what we can see now that these are real major gas investment projects, not only in the region, but it means something for Europe. It has a meaning for the region, it has a meaning for Europe. We see that 3 of the major pipeline projects are for gas export from Turkmenistan, Trans-Caspian, Central Asia, China, and TAPI. And, well, Turkmenistan is, as we know, one of the most closed economies in the world. And all 3 projects are to be either fully financed with foreign investment or with partial Turkmen government funding. Then there is TANAP, connecting pipeline to Europe's TAP, and of course also the Trans-Caspian pipeline. They would have the potential to significantly alter the gas import market in Europe. And what Europe is looking for is for diversification in its gas supply. So it's a real important issue. What we can see is that the potential full capacity of around 30 billion cubic meters could be achieved in 2028. But it's important that also we recognize that the Trans-Caspian pipeline discussions have not progressed as far as those of TANAP. However, if the project eventuates, the supplies of gas from the Caspian Sea could replace a significant portion of Europe's gas imports from its sole supplier, at present, Russia. So is it important to Europe? Yes, in our view, it is important to Europe because of diversification. Now, I don't know whether I answered all the questions.
Would you like to answer some questions?
Yes, since there was the question about whether or not we still follow the same approach and the same concept concerning the Trans-Caspian gas pipeline, as was just said, the Trans-Caspian gas pipeline is a very essential part of the European energy policy, diversification, security of supply. And the European Union and the European Commission, on behalf of the European Union, is negotiating with Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan since 2011. We had different rounds. We are not yet there, so we still need to work on it, but there is definitely no change in the overall concept of it and the relevance. If ever, the Trans-Caspian gas pipeline is even more significant than it had been. And we might even see, if we see a further evolution in relations, for instance, with Iran and the lifting of sanctions, that this might open up an additional economic potential for that pipeline, because flows can go into different directions. Thank you.
It may be too premature to guess, but do you have any ideas like when the Trans-Caspian pipeline could be up and running at the earliest and maybe connect to the TANAP, which is not yet existing?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I was just hoping, but maybe in terms of the effect that the war in Ukraine has had on the energy mix, if there was something which was really a little bit more clear and usable as a soundbite, basically. I mean, has this devastated Ukraine's energy supplies? Has it only slightly harmed it? Just something which a reader, a non-expert reader would understand as a way of explaining the effect that the war's had on Ukraine's energy.
My name is Lubomitev. I work for NucNet. In parts of the report, especially for Belarus and Armenia, you mentioned the role of nuclear power as important in reducing dependency and increasing trade between the countries, the neighboring countries, in electricity. Could you talk a little bit more about that? How important is it? Thank you.
That was the last question. In our view, nuclear power is a very important base load provision for electricity. And of course, there are countries that are phasing out their nuclear power. Well, that's up to them. But let's be very frank about it. Nuclear power is also a zero CO2 emissions power supply. And what we see is that the number of the countries that we looked into are relying on it. On the other hand, it's aging infrastructure. So it means that that has either to be worked on to extend the lifeline of the actual nuclear power plants, or you have to build new ones. And then, of course, my last remark would lead to hopefully the use of the latest technology. Then about your question about the sound bites, well, I have to admit that's not my strongest point to give you sound bites. So let me put it like that. What we have seen that there is in the Ukraine a growing reliance on coal, and that, of course, is a clear result of what is happening there, had been happening there in the past 2 years. So if that is what you're looking for, well, this is one of the clearest things I could give you. There is a shift towards the use of coal in Ukraine. We can see that. On the other hand, that brings, of course, a number of questions with it. Coal is, as we know, the dirtiest fossil fuel we have. So from our point of view, it would be good if you only build the high efficiency, low emissions kind of coal-fired power generation plants and use latest state-of-the-art technology and not old technology. And this is, of course, a concern that we have as far as Ukraine goes.
I may perhaps add concerning Ukraine, the Commission is monitoring on a daily basis the supply of gas to Ukraine. Now, one particular instance, of course, is the provision of gas to the two self-declared republics of Donetsk and Lugansk, which had been supplied from the west of Ukraine, which receives Russian gas through agreed transit points and redistributed towards these regions. And that has been replaced in the recent past more and more by direct supplies of Russian gas into that region using different transit points, which were not the ones that had been agreed upon in the contracts between the Ukrainian gas company and Gazprom. But that would indicate that a large part, at least, of the installations still functions, but that the flows are now going in using different parts of the pipeline system. And the big question is about measurement and finding out what are the volumes that are being supplied or not, because, of course, Ukraine is formally held to pay for all of the volume of gas delivered by Gazprom into Ukraine. And the problem is that Naftogaz, the Ukrainian company, declares that they are not in a position to verify whether the reported quantities supplied into the two self-declared republics of Donetsk and Lugansk, whether these quantities are really supplied or not, and whether they should pay the bill for it. So there's a slightly opaque situation there. Now, concerning the question, when would we see the Trans-Caspian gas pipeline come on stream? If I had a crystal ball, it would make my life much easier. But I would then definitely not bet on a given date, because having a gas pipeline up and running is determined by a series of factors. It's not just about having the plans, it's about having the plans approved, having the works commissioned, having the financing ensured, and all of the surrounding legislative and regulatory and contractual framework in place. The experience tells from the past that it's very difficult to meet the initial target dates. And therefore, unfortunately, I cannot provide you with any date or year for that. Perhaps I might add one piece of information to the first question that was concerning rule of law. Rule of law, which is a very important concept. It is a very important concept as part equally of all of our efforts to see transformation in neighboring countries. But it's not just about that transformation. Rule of law is not only a concept invented by the European Union. It is a concept which should apply normally worldwide. It's very important because it is one of the fundamentals for doing business, for having confidence, for having a state which can claim to be on a sustainable basis. And therefore, we are advocating rule of law everywhere in the world, not just because it is enshrined, it's part of our understanding of how to run a country, how to organize a state, how to organize the relations between trade partners, between individuals, how to respect the rights of individual persons. But it is a precondition for attracting foreign direct investment. Investors need to be sure that they enter a level playing field, that they have a possibility to enforce contracts if they have concluded a contract, and that there is an environment which allows them to contract, to deal with partners in an environment which is transparent and which is fair. And therefore, we are advocating generally to introduce rule of law. One important aspect, of course, of that is to fight corruption, because corruption hinders the judiciary, hinders the enforcement of existing contracts, and is an obstacle to have a level playing field. And therefore, it's quite clear that, for instance, when we deal with the countries in the Eastern Partnership, rule of law is one of the key areas. And in particular, where we have more detailed contractual relations, such as with Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine, where we have concluded deep and comprehensive free trade agreements, these countries undertook to carry out important reforms which cover inter alia rule of law. So, for instance, for Ukraine, this is one of the key elements that we address and where we equally provide financial and technical support to the country in order to introduce the necessary legislative reforms, but equally to set up the appropriate judiciary and administrative structures so that we can hope that in a couple of years we will see there a situation which would be compliant with the concept of rule of law. Thank you.
I'm sorry to come back again. Perhaps I haven't been entirely clear. I mean, either way, in the report it says Ukraine is confronted with unprecedented challenges as it faces geopolitical, economic, financial, humanitarian, and energy crises at the same time. I mean, is that an evaluation that you agree with? I assume yes. And but it would be useful for me to have one of you say that. And is all of that Russia's fault?
I'm sorry. But it is the first thing you mentioned, that it's a fact that Ukraine is living through a number of crises, and that's it. And in the book, there is nothing about whose fault that is. Because this is not a political statement, this is a statement, this is a book about the energy situation in 11 countries. And when we are talking about policy and political statements, that's not something for the IEA.
It's Mrs. van der Hoven. Why doesn't the report give regional recommendations for renewable energy, or it does? Because from what I've seen, I just skimmed through the report, it gives country by country recommendations for the different areas, but you also give them regional recommendations.
I don't know what you read until now, but when you have a look into the executive summary, you can find the answer to your question. It's not only country by country, but it's also on a regional basis. For instance, the grid integration connected with the problem of the intermittency of the variable renewables is something that is covered in it as well.
We would like to thank you very much, and we will now proceed with the interviews as scheduled. Thank you very much. Thank you.